Hello, everybody. I hope you all are doing great. It's great to have you all here. So, today I'm here to discuss with you all another topic, that is when demand and supply curve shift at the same time. So, today we are going to be talking about the same. Let's get started. So, generally, the supply and demand do not change in an individual manner. It is not that only demands changes at a particular time or only supply changes at a particular time. Those are just a theoretical knowledge that is required, but in reality, in the practical world, they do not change in an individual manner. There is a simultaneous change in both. Okay, so this gives birth to four cases. Let us have a look at each of the case. Both demand and supply decreases. Either the demand and supply both will decrease simultaneously. Both demand and supply increases. Either the demand or supply both will increase simultaneously. Demand decreases but supply increases. Yes, there are chances when demand for that product has decreased but simultaneously supply for the same has increased, and demand increases but supply decreases. It can be vice versa, that demand has increased but supply has decreased, maybe due to some of the reasons. Alright, let's have a look at each one of them. See, firstly, we'll be talking about both demand and supply decreases. What are the cases that are going to be what are the effects on the equilibrium price when both demand and supply decreases at the same time? Let us have a look. The final market conditions can be determined only by knowing the magnitude of decrease in both the demand and supply. Obviously, we should be aware of how much demand and supply both have decreased by. The magnitude is very important because that plays a very crucial role in deciding the new market equilibrium price and quantity. Okay, so we need to be aware of the magnitude. There is a need to compare their magnitudes. Such conditions are better analyzed by comparing the changes. So what are the chances of having this situation? What are the magnitudes? What are the possibilities of the same? Either it could be demand and supply decrease is equal, the amount by which the demand is decreasing, the magnitude by which demand is decreasing, the same magnitude supply also decreases. Either that it can be the magnitude of decrease in demand is greater than the magnitude of decrease in supply, or the last case can be the magnitude of decrease in supply is greater than the magnitude of decrease in the demand. So we'll be discussing each one of them. Just have a look at this graph. Here we have the P1, that is the equilibrium price, and Q1 is the equilibrium quantity. The first case we are discussing is the decrease in demand is equal to the decrease in supply. So here we are talking about when there is a decrease in demand and supply which is equal. So what will be the condition? So this is my supply curve S. If my supply curve shifts to S1, there is a decrease in the supply. So of course it will be shifting leftwards, and my demand curve D also shifts leftwards if there is a decrease in demand. So our equilibrium, this was the market equilibrium, but now our new market equilibrium will shift over here at the new S1 and D1. So what are its impact? The price is here, the price is the same in this situation, but the quantity has decreased. So we are able to analyze that with a proportionate decrease in the demand and supply curve, the price remains the same but the equilibrium quantity declines. Okay, whenever you have any question about the demand and supply curve, the proportions of the declines or the proportion of the increase, you always have to keep in mind the graph. If you have the graph clear in your mind, then you will not be confused with what are its impact going to be on the price and quantity. When the magnitude of the decrease in both demand and the supply are equal, it will lead to proportionate shift that is the equal shift in both demand and supply curve, and consequently the equilibrium price remains the same, but there is a decrease in the equilibrium quantity. So I hope this graph is very much clear to you all. Let's have a look at the other situation. When the decrease in demand is greater than decrease in supply, that means the proportion by which demand has decreased is much more higher than the proportion by which supply has decreased. You can see our demand curve D and our supply curve S. The equilibrium, market equilibrium lies here. This is the Q is the equilibrium quantity and P is the equilibrium price. So this is the situation now. Demand has decreased to D1. So there is a shift in the demand curve. The new demand curve is D1, and also supply curve has decreased, but in a lesser proportion compared to the demand curve. So our new supply curve is S1. So this will be our new equilibrium. This is the case of, what can you see? Can you see anything over here? What case it is when there is a greater decrease in demand than decrease in supply? It means there is excess supply. This situation is of excess supply because demand, see, the demand and supply were equal. The decrease in demand is greater and decrease in supply is lower. So this is a situation of excess supply. So obviously the market forces will work accordingly to wipe off the excess supply. We have discussed about the all of the market forces that impact on it in the previous video. So the market forces will work accordingly in order to wipe off the excess supply and hence creating a new equilibrium, that is E1 will be the new equilibrium. So what will be the end result? The price will decrease, the equilibrium price will decrease, it will shift from P to P1 and the quantity also decreases. Okay, so this is going to be the result of greater decrease in the demand compared to the decrease in supply. The decrease in quantity is relatively more than decrease in price. Of course, you can see the quantity has decreased in a larger proportion as compared to decrease in the price. All right. Coming on to the next topic. When the decrease in demand is less than decrease in supply. Now this is the third and last situation possible for both demand and supply curve decreasing. So this is the last situation that the decrease in supply is greater than decrease in the demand. So our supply curve S will shift to S1. There is a decrease in supply, and our demand curve D will shift to D1. There is a lesser greater decline in the demand. So the decline in the supply is greater than decrease in the demand. So what will be the impact of it on new equilibrium? Of course, again, it is a case of excess demand, because when you see demand supply, when there is a decrease in demand, okay, but there is a greater decrease in the supply. So this is a situation of excess demand. So obviously the market forces will work accordingly to wipe off the excess demand. So here the equilibrium which we'll be getting, the new equilibrium at D1 and S1, will gradually lead to increase in the prices and decrease in the quantity. Okay. So in case in which the decrease in demand is smaller than the decrease in supply, the leftward shift of demand curve is less than the leftward shift of supply curve. So notably, there is a rise in equilibrium price from P to P1 and accompanied by a fall in the equilibrium quantity. Here also you can see the decline in the quantity is greater than the increase in the price. Alright. I hope these three situations are very much clear to you all. Let's have a look at another situation. When both demand and supply curve increases. Here we are talking about what are the impacts when they move, when they shift at the same time. Alright. In such a condition, both demand and supply will shift rightwards. Obviously, when there is an increase in demand, the curve shifts rightward. and when there is an increase in supply, the supply curve also shifts towards the right. So in order to study the changes in market equilibrium, we need to compare the increase in both entities and then conclude accordingly. Such a condition is further studied, of course, with the following three cases. First, we'll have to assume that by whatever proportion the demand has increased, the same proportion our supply has also increased. So the first situation is when the increase in demand is equal to the increase in supply. So here S and D, this is our equilibrium price, this is our equilibrium quantity. Now when demand curve shifts towards the right, that means there is an increase in demand. So the new demand curve is the D1, and the new supply curve also shifts rightward when there is an increase in supply. So the new supply curve is S1. When they are shifting in the same proportion, what will be the impact? The new equilibrium will lie over here, which will keep the prices constant. That means the price will be the same, but quantity supplied or demand, the quantity, that is the equilibrium quantity, new equilibrium quantity will increase. If the increase in both demand and supply is exactly equal, there occurs a proportionate shift in the demand and supply curve. So consequently, the equilibrium price will remain the same. However, the equilibrium quantity will rise. Looking at the another situation when increase in demand is greater than increase in supply. Again, when the demand has rise by a higher proportion, higher magnitude as compared to the increase in demand proportion. So our demand curve D shifts from D to D1, and our supply curve, supply also increases, it shifts from S to S1, but the proportion of the shift of the movements is less. Okay, in such a case, okay, we could just have it from the graph. The equilibrium price is here and equilibrium quantity will be here. Now when there is a shift in both demand and supply, when the increase in demand is greater than the increase in supply, the new equilibrium will be at E1, which will be causing a new equilibrium price to be higher than the old one, and the quantity also increases. In such a case, the right shift of the demand curve is more relatively as compared to the supply curve. So effectively, both equilibrium price and quantity tend to increase. Okay. Now comes the last situation of the same, when the increase in supply is greater than increase in demand, or you can say increase in demand is less as compared to the increase in supply. So here is our old equilibrium at P price, equilibrium price, and Q is the equilibrium quantity. When the supply has increased by a greater proportion as compared to increase in demand, so the S supply curve will shift here rightward to S1, and our demand curve will be new D1 will be our new demand curve. So the price will fall because market forces will work accordingly, which will make the prices to fall, and since supply has increased in a greater proportion, quantity will also increase. So our new equilibrium will be at E1, which will be leading to decline in the prices and increase in the quantity. So the new equilibrium price will be higher and new equilibrium quantity, the new equilibrium price will be lower and the new equilibrium quantity will be greater. Okay, so in this case, the equilibrium price falls, whereas the equilibrium quantity rises. I hope this is very much clear. It's better to always keep the graph in mind so that there is no confusion, because there are many situations like this. Okay, so we have to have a clarity in this. So if we have a graph, if we are very much clear with the graphic solutions, then it becomes very easy for us to understand any situation that we might be asked to do. Okay, now when demand decreases but supply increases, yes, this is a different situation. When there is a decrease in demand but simultaneously an increase in the supply, so what are the impacts? Of course, first the magnitude of decrease in the demand and increase in the supply could be equal, or the magnitude of decrease in demand could be greater than the increase in supply, or also it could be vice versa. So let's have a look at each of the situation. This condition translates to the fact that the demand curve shifts leftward, of course, because there is a decrease in demand, whereas the supply curve will shift rightwards. As they move in the opposite directions, the final market conditions can be seen by pointing out the magnitude. Again, to know the magnitude, we'll take the three situations. First, if the decrease in demand is equal to the increase in supply. This is our first situation which we'll be discussing. This is our market equilibrium. This is our equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Now there is a decrease in demand. That means the demand curve has shifted leftwards and the new demand curve is D1. And increase in the supply, that is our supply curve has shifted rightwards and the new supply curve is the S1. So what will be the impact of this? See, here you could call it excess demand, excess supply also you could call it. So the new equilibrium will be lying over here. That is, in this case, the equilibrium price, first the equilibrium price was at P, now the equilibrium price will be P1, that is, it will be lower and the quantity will remain constant because the decrease is equal to the increase in supply. So in this case also, although the two curves move in opposite directions, the magnitude of their shifts is same. So effectively what will happen? The equilibrium quantity will remain the same, but the equilibrium price will fall because demand has decreased and supply has increased. So suppliers will will compete with one another in order to sell off their goods. So this will gradually lead to decline in the prices. Again, this is a part of market forces will act accordingly. Alright. Now comes a situation when the decrease in demand is greater than increase in supply. For example, our demand curve D has got a new demand curve. There's a decrease in the demand. So the new demand curve for us is D1, and there is a increase in supply but in a lesser proportion. Okay, when the supply has increased by lesser proportion. So first our equilibrium was at P1 and Q1. This was our equilibrium price and Q1 was our equilibrium quantity. Now in the new when there is a shift in both demand and supply curve, the new equilibrium will gradually be decreasing the quantity as well as decreasing the price. So when the decrease in demand is greater than increase in the supply, what will happen? Both equilibrium quantity and equilibrium price both will be falling. Okay, because when demand has decreased by a greater proportion as compared to increase in the supply, so it will be obviously leading to decrease in the equilibrium quantity as well as fall in the equilibrium price. Now, if increase in supply is greater than decrease in demand, that the demand has decreased by a lesser proportion as compared to how much by supply has increased. So obviously we are able to make out that the prices will go down only, and as supply has increased, so obviously the quantity supplied will increase and which will lead to equilibrium quantity to rise. So here you can see the demand curve D will shift towards left. The D1 will be our new demand curve. The supply curve will, the new supply curve will be S1, the new supply curve, because there is an increase in supply in a greater proportion than decrease in the demand. So our equilibrium was over here at P1 and Q1. Now our new equilibrium lies over here at P2 and Q2. You can see that the prices have declined, the new equilibrium prices have declined and new equilibrium quantity increases. So the leftward shift of demand curve is less than the rightward shift of supply curve. it is important to realize that the equilibrium quantity rises whereas the equilibrium price will fall. I hope I have made these situations very easy for you to understand, because this is the easiest way I could just put it for you, so that you don't have to, stress about it, and just you could just know what it is in a very clear way. Now, when the demand increases but supply decreases, this is the fourth situation, when demand will increase but gradually supply will decrease. So again, it will further be three cases which will help us to study these things in a much easier way. Similar to the aforementioned condition, here also the demand and supply curve move in opposite directions, but the demand curve shift towards the right, which is indicating an increase in demand, and supply curve will be shifting towards the left, which will indicate the decrease in supply. So let us study them. First, when the increase in demand is equal to decrease in supply, when demand will increase, our demand curve D will shift to D1. This will be our new demand curve, and this is our supply when supply will decrease. So there will be a leftward shift in the supply curve. The new supply curve will be S1. Our equilibrium price was at P1 and equilibrium quantity was at Q1. Now, looking at the new situation, the S1 and D1, you can see that prices have increased to P2, but the quantity is remaining the same. When the increase in the uh, demand and decrease in the supply is in equal proportion or magnitude. So, when the increase in demand is equal to decrease in supply, the shifts in both supply and the demand curve are proportionately equal. So, the equilibrium quantity will remain constant, but the prices will increase because of decrease in the supply and increase in the demand. Prices will obviously go higher. Now, when this is the second situation for the same, when there is an increase in demand which is greater than the decrease in supply. So, our demand curve D shifts in a larger proportion to D1 as compared to our supply curve S shifting to S1. So, the proportion of shift of demand curve, the increase in demand is greater than the decrease in supply. So when demand increases, you could just understand it with the market forces. When demand is very high for a product, obviously the consumers will compete within one another to buy that particular product, which will lead to increase in the prices. So obviously the new equilibrium price that we'll be getting is at P2, which is higher as compared to the old equilibrium price, and quantity will also increase. In this case, the right shift of the demand curve is proportionately more than the leftward shift of the supply curve. Hence, both the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity will rise. Now, looking at the last situation for the same, if the increase in demand is less than decrease in supply, when the demand increases in a lesser proportion than the decrease in the supply. So what will be the situation for the same? When demand increased by a very less proportion but supply decreased by a larger proportion. Again, it will cause the prices to hike because consumers want to buy the product. The demand still the supply is low. It is still a situation of excess demand only. So the equilibrium quantity will fall, whereas the equilibrium price will increase. This is our new equilibrium price, and this Q2 will be our new equilibrium quantity. So I hope these situations are very much clear to you all, and I have tried my best to make it the easiest for you. And here we have completed our shifts in the demand and supply curve. What are its impact on the new equilibrium prices and quantity? If you liked the way you were taught all this, you could enroll for my course at Bridge Gap Academy. Thank you for watching this video. Have a great day. Goodbye.